I'm Captain Logan, and welcome once again to the vast and ominous Comic Vault. It's time for new acquisitions. Today I've got 5 brand new ones for you, select books from my pull list, and we're going to alternate today, going back and forth between Marvel and DC. I've got 2 DC books and 3 Marvel books. We're going to start today with Marvel, with Silver Surfer #1, but before we get into it, let me say thanks as always to Elite Comics in Overland Park, Kansas, for helping me out in the show. If you are ever in the Kansas City area, be sure to check them out. They're an absolutely fantastic store. As I said, beginning with Silver Surfer #1. This is written by Dan Slott with art by Michael Allred and beautiful, glorious colors by Laura Allred. Just look at this hilarious, bizarre cover. It's absolutely wonderful. And what I'm going to start doing from now on is tell you at the end if I think this is a book that you should pick up, of course, depending on your taste, that you should pick up, that you should skip, or that you should wait for trade. So without further ado, Silver Surfer #1. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to see Silver Surfer continuing in the same style and creative direction pre-Secret Wars, and I'm a little shocked the title is continuing. This is the longest-running Silver Surfer solo title since the 145-issue Volume 3 ended in the late 90s, and regardless of renumbering, I hope this one sticks around for at least a couple more years. The book continues its admittedly heavily Doctor Who-influenced quirky and absurd space escapades filled with random, silly, way-out-there Douglas Adams-level imagery, but it's grounded by its thoughtful exploration of the human condition, as Silver Surfer's companion, Dawn, teaches him how to be more in touch with his emotions, and he teaches her about the endless and wondrous possibilities of the universe, and that compassion is universal. Impressively, Slott and Allred don't lose that spirit as Dawn and the Surfer finally return to the Earth they watched with horror disappear along with the rest of the universe at the end of the previous series, when the Marvel multiverse was extinguished and they very nearly recreated it before Doctor Doom had a chance to in Secret Wars. This is one of the wilder and more out there premises I've seen for this team, and there are some really wild contenders. And it's appropriate because, as we find by the end, that mind-bending cosmic wackiness seems to be on its way to Earth's doorstep, and it's not going to look as relatively down to itself as it does right now for long. I'm also really excited about how the Thing fits into all that. A major thread running through this series has been the importance and tangibility of the imagination, that human beings, or in this context, any self-aware creature, has an immense amount of power to shape and influence reality because of its capacity to create. A seemingly malevolent, four-eyed species called the Hordax makes its way to Earth at the beginning, intending to steal the Earth's greatest resource, its culture. And the revelation of what their motivations are for doing this is expectation-bending and classic for this series. They're able to take every original piece of art, be it painting, music, story, what have you, and extract it from every person on the planet to preserve for themselves. This is that heightened, ultra-creative storytelling that really appeals to my sensibilities dialed up to 11. A story so imaginative I wish I'd thought of it, that's also really thought-provoking and tries to get at the heart of why art matters in the first place. I like the cover a lot because it's filled with an eclectic assortment of disparate images, which certainly helps the reader to know what he's getting himself into if he didn't follow the last series, but also because the story is about why all those silly, some of them maybe innocuous, man-made trinkets and artifacts need to exist. It's about ideas building on each other, the evolution of culture, and I really like how this issue gets around intellectual property laws to discuss that. What really hits me where I live is that it then focuses all its attention on stories, why we need fictional heroes to aspire to, and how we make those protagonists real and have a real relationship with them. It takes that metaphysical notion to its furthest conclusion and literally makes those characters real when the Hordax becomes every protagonist ever dreamed up on Earth. It's a fast read if you're just reading for plot, but you could live with this material a long time if you stop and smell the roses. It's a lot of fun scrutinizing the various characters and trying to guess who all the Hordaxes are supposed to be, which isn't always easy, since they have such alien faces. And thematically, I don't think the choice to give them 4 eyes is arbitrary. I especially enjoyed seeing Neo from The Matrix, Willy Wonka, and Marty McFly, who I kind of appreciate says heavy because otherwise I'm not sure I would have figured that one out on my own. It's a great meta experience because it's a fantasy about an endearing character I find myself admiring and who becomes real on the page that explores that very phenomenon. I also like Dawn's reunion with her family and how their every holiday Dawn's missed in a year party factors into the theme of why culture is important. And just like with all the Horaxes turning into popular fictional characters, there's a lot of fun details to stare at. It would be easy to turn any one of these pages into a Where's Waldo or I Spy picture. I might have expected Slott and Allred to be out of ideas by now, but it feels like Silver Surfer, appropriate with a number 1, is just getting started. If this sort of out there science fantasy appeals to you and you missed the first run, this is a perfect jumping on point. And I think it's maybe even the best issue and best standalone story, even though it's certainly setting up things for the future, this team has put together. Slott's characterization for Peter Parker never clicked with me on Spider-Man, but he's creating something really special here. And I think this is going to go down in history as the best run on the character next to the original Stan Lee limited series. And of course, I'm going to say this is definitely a pickup if these are your sensibilities, if you're really into the quirky, crazy science fiction stuff. Even if you don't read anywhere beyond this with this series, this is really easy to just pick up and read this story and really enjoy it. So definitely going to say pick up with this one. Let's go ahead and move on now to our first DC book for the week. This is quite a mouthful, Justice League, The Darkseid War, Flash, number 1. This is a tie-in to the new Justice League Darkseid War event, and this is written by Rob Williams with art by Jesus Marino. I know it's odd to introduce myself to a comics event via a tie-in, but I've been a little distant from the comics industry the last few months and wasn't even aware Darkseid War was happening. I also haven't read any Flash at all since before New 52. I've heard from Flash fans that the title has been abysmal lately, but having read almost nothing Flash in my life, besides a few issues of John's run right before the reboot, I have nothing to compare it to, so my expectations are really low. And this issue caught my eye, so I thought I'd get adventurous. One of my favorite things to do with comics, because this is how I was introduced to the medium as a kid, is to jump into a story midstream and see if that single issue holds my attention, despite not having read anything before it. Since a lot of superhero comics are serialized narratives, constantly building on really long continuities outside of the occasional obligatory reboot, reading comics can sort of be like that anyway. This issue does a pretty good job of jumping a new reader right in the action with just enough context for the situation to be able to follow the action here, and without it feeling like it's spending a lot of its pages catching people up to speed. Darkseid's dead, his Black Racer, the personification, or perhaps just a personification of death, I'm kind of fuzzy on that, merged with the Flash, and now Barry Allen is forced to do the Grim Reaper's job. Like, one page, and I completely understand the premise, and it also does a fantastic job establishing its tone and the ideas it wants to explore. Like a lot of Justice League stories, this is an event about gods and the difference between a deity and a hero. The really interesting thing about Barry's predicament here is that in becoming a god, he has to accept limitation, which sounds like an inherent contradiction. He wants to master death in order to save everyone, refusing to admit that he was born out of death and is defined by it because of the death of his mother, which was the catalyst that made him become the Flash, as the Black Racer tells him. Oh, and I like that the entity directly talks to Barry and serves as Barry's ghost of Christmas future, although I didn't need Barry to come right out and make that reference. I imagine anyone with a high school education would have made the same parallel a page before he says it. But gods like of the Greek or Norse pantheons are only immortal and omnipotent relative to the mortals they rule over. They have physical limitations, and they are bound by rules because they're part of a natural order. So in order to be a god, Barry would have to accept that there are things he can't change, and that death has to be a part of life, or the whole universe would fall apart. I'm not sure how I feel about the literal way the issue reveals that would happen, because, without giving too much away, it sort of breaks down the whole gods having limitations thing, and frankly, once Barry goes toe-to-toe against the Black Racer, the issue goes from gripping philosophical melodrama to typical and, by the end, maybe even incoherent superhero schlock. But the ideas are certainly fascinating, and I enjoyed the exploration of what Barry's chemical makeup really is. I don't know if readers who have lived with this character a long time, and especially fans of Barry Allen pre-52, will appreciate the notion that if Barry became a god, he'd become blinded by power and try to end death itself without considering what the world would be like without the Flash and what he stands for, which wouldn't exist without that, or at the very least, just consequences in general. I guess the other members of the Justice League are becoming gods too, and the idea seems to be having these heroes walk a mile in Darkseid's shoes and see if it changes them. It does does change Barry, and the big downer for me is how easy it is for him to change back without really living with the horrors of what he might have created in his naivety and short-sightedness. It sure does its job for me in that it made me interested in reading more of this event, and I may do just that. It's kind of driving me crazy right now how every big story arc in superhero comics seems to be something war. There's always a war. That word's becoming a marketing gimmick in comics like Dark is in movies, and frankly like Dark has been in comics before too. DC and Marvel are both culprits of this. Secret Wars, Civil War 2, Robin War. There seems to be a Green Lantern War every year, and Marvel's biggest moneymaker right now is Star Wars. Okay, we get it. There's a lot of people shooting at each other in comics. I am getting numbed to that word. Anyway, I was a lot more engrossed in this than I usually am a one-and-done tie-in issue that probably won't have much bearing ultimately on the story at large, and is probably totally skippable. But I wouldn't have even considered reading that event if I hadn't tried this, so it just goes to show, you never know. I also think that if you're familiar with the Flash TV show, but you've never read Flash comics, you'll be right at home here, and probably be surprised by just how much the history, mythology, and characterization matches up to what you've seen on television. And the art's pretty good. It's traditional, kinetic, lightning bolts in every panel, driving Flash art. It's not a great comic, but I found it, for the most part, enjoyable and educational. This one's kind of a tough call. I think it's a really easy book to just pick up and read, as I said, but it's wholly skippable. I would say if the premise of this sounds like fun to you, maybe take what I got from it and just start with the next issue of Justice League and read that, although I haven't read it yet because it's not out, so I have no idea if that's any good. But I think this is certainly wholly skippable, so I guess I'm trepidatious about it. I guess I'm going to call this one a skip. Let's move on now to Captain Marvel #1, the new Captain Marvel. This is from Marvel, of course, and this is Captain Marvel is from Marvel. And this is written by Michelle Fazakis and Tara Butters with art by Chris Anka. A brand new post for Carol Danvers on a space station orbiting Earth. Alpha Flight, classic space opera motifs, a fascinating, possibly cosmic mystery. Michelle Fazakis and Tara Butters have concocted a really fresh status quo for Captain Marvel and created what I imagine is a great blend between a new science fiction space commander direction for the character and everything people loved about her in the first place. I say I imagine because I never got around to reading any of the previous Captain Marvel stuff during the Marvel Now days, but kind of regret that now that I finally tried this out. I'm a little familiar with her from her appearances in Bendis' Guardians of the Galaxy, but I never had the kind of clear picture I have of what she's all about now just after reading this single setup issue for her new status quo. This is a book that is as sure of itself as its protagonist and doesn't feel the need to sell new readers on the character at all. It simply presents her as she is, and she is a breath of fresh air. I instantly understand who Carol is more through her actions than her internal monologue, but that's good too, and her personality is totally unique. After just 22 pages, I feel like I have a great handle on what makes her a great leader and why she's so well regarded both amongst her peers in the universe and amongst fans that took to her instantly when she took the Captain Marvel mantle. I also feel like I understand the character quirks that are likely to get her into trouble in the future. There's an excellent use of unreliable narrator throughout in her internal monologue, which is filled with complex, believable thoughts and reactions. Carol is ultra-confident on the outside, and she thinks she's that way inside too, but she's in denial about a lot of things, about what she can't control, about the more deep-seated reasons she may have chosen to take herself out of the limelight and run a space station with Alpha Flight in what Rocket Raccoon calls a desk job, but which she doesn't want to see that way. No doubt the series will start exploring her motivations for taking that job and for feeling the need to always be front and center on every mission despite taking herself out of the public spotlight intentionally. I love her dry wit, like when she's tackling a huge heaping mound of trash in space and she says, "If I go out now, at least I know all there is to know about waste management." I like how upfront and candid she is with everyone, and I like her refusal to see shades of gray. Or at least her attempt at doing that. Again, that's a thing that she's not 100% sure that she can always do. She, of course, has a morality and worldview that's very similar to Captain America, but she seems to be lacking in his humility and maybe has more of Tony Stark's arrogance. I wasn't sure if this was a book I wanted to keep reading. reading, even though I was enjoying learning so much about Carol's personality and really liked all the various forms of banter between characters who really like her, like Rhodey, and others who can't stand her, like Abigail Brand, although I don't know if Brand gets along with anybody, really. But Carol on a space station leading Alpha Flight, I couldn't decide if that was something I could really get excited about for the long haul. But then the big what, huh, cliffhanger that takes a kind of intriguing mystery to a I've just gotta know sort of place, and which immediately confirms that this book is going to be a total character study for Carol and force her to take a good hard look at herself. I like that it's not another human hero thrown into the cosmic fray sort of book like Venom Space Knight. At least it's not that yet. Using Carol as the first line of defense right outside of Earth's atmosphere makes perfect sense, and it gives the book an almost Fantastic Four-ish astronaut sort of vibe, which really sets it apart from all the kooky space adventure books. It's a dense issue with plenty of character stuff to sink my teeth into, and it did exactly what I hoped it would. It made me ask myself why the heck I haven't been reading this character all along. I'm going to say this is definitely a pickup or possibly a wait for trade. As I said, didn't know if I wanted to keep going with it until I got to the very end of the issue, so I'm very enticed to keep going, but I could certainly see waiting for trade because that cliffhanger might not pay off in as exciting a way as it looks like it's going to. Who knows? So I'm going to say it's between a pickup and, again, just depending on what your sensibilities are and what you like, I'm somewhere between a pickup and a wait for trade on this one. Now back to DC. Here is Poison Ivy Cycle of Life and Death #1. This is the first of a 6-part miniseries, and this is written by Amy Chu with art by Clayman. DC has been doing a lot of these 6-issue miniseries featuring villains or anti-heroes as protagonists lately, and I appreciate the variety of characters it's putting front and center, the attempt at exploring some of these characters in a type of story that fits their personality but might not in a story featuring them as the bad guy, and that they're long enough to either really tell a compelling story or else have a lot of short adventures without getting canceled prematurely because they're minor characters that probably couldn't sustain a monthly on their own. This time it's the third of the Gotham City Sirens that doesn't currently have her own book, and I think it's a safe bet to say Poison Ivy has always been the least popular of the trio, stacked up next to Harley Quinn and Catwoman. I haven't read a lot of really good Batman stories featuring Poison Ivy, and a lot of them seem to be kind of the same. There are a lot of stories about Pamela Isley trying to reassimilate into society, only to find she doesn't like human beings and finds them inferior, and this is one of those stories. Pamela goes on an expedition to find a living fossil, a plant that can live for hundreds of years, and she manages to get a job, incognito of course, doing research on taking those properties and making living things in general live a lot longer than they're supposed to. She makes it clear right away that it's more about the research than it is about her wanting to find any common ground with human beings. She kills a guy in the opening pages with, as you'd expect, a giant plant because his gang has laid claim to the territory in Africa she's exploring. I'm sure he's a bad dude, but it's obvious Poison Ivy has no regard for human life, except for the couple of people she comes to admire or at least enjoy spending time with, like a fellow researcher who got her the job and who she sees as an exception to her belief that humans are frail and pitiful and poor communicators compared to everything connected to the green, which is the first time I've seen Poison Ivy talk about things on Swamp Thing terms, but I wouldn't be surprised to find that's not new and it's just new to me. But there's not much legwork done up front with Ivy's relationship to this doctor beyond she's really smart and her research is useful. Harley Quinn makes an obligatory appearance in order to make Ivy reevaluate her perhaps useless attempt at making connections with people when she acts superior, and Harley, kind of out of nowhere, decides she thinks Ivy thinks she's stupid. As much as I like the idea that Harley theoretically gets how people work while Ivy is clueless because she's a psychologist and she might be able to help Ivy fit in with people better if only she wasn't a lunatic, this version of Harley continues to feel all over the map to me. She's totally lucid most of the time, and I really don't understand where her violent tendencies are coming from. She's also, as I've complained about before, a super genius now, and makes a big deal out of how she has a PhD, and she does a lot more with those skills than she did in the previous continuity. So I don't know why she's so insecure about her intelligence. That strikes me as a holdover from the old version that doesn't fit now, because she's a totally different, but maybe not altogether defined still, character. Harley's really smart about psychology. Ivy's really smart about science. I get that one's supposed to be street smart, one's book smart, and if they'd each get past their inadequacies, they could take advantage of each other and become more whole people. But it feels really forced with this version of Harley. The psychological and identity issues are potentially interesting and worth exploring, and I didn't altogether dislike this comic, but the big surprise at the end didn't really inspire me to want to read on. There's also a lot of eye candy and excuses for Ivy to take her clothes off, which I seem to see in every book featuring any of the sirens. Again, I haven't read everything, but whenever I've checked in, it's been there. And while it's not exactly offensive to me, and Ivy is certainly all about being natural and wouldn't really have modern sensibilities about modesty, so if any woman in the DC universe is gonna go around naked, it'd be her. It reads as intrusive and counter to having Harley Quinn beat the crap out of a guy for sexually harassing a girl. I don't mind women looking sexy in comic books, or even the often outrageous proportions we see with both women and men in comics with their godlike physiques, but this is the equivalent of shower scenes in horror and action movies, just trying to appeal to every possible demographic at once. It has a potential, but if I was holding up the feeling it not feeling it sign, it'd be hard to decide which way to flip. This is a definite wait for trade for me. I'm probably going to keep going just because I buy a lot of the Batman stuff, but I would say, having no idea how this is all going to end and if it's going to be a really typical Poison Ivy story or if it might go its own way and make some waves, I'd say definitely kind of a wait for trade on this. It could be great, but so far, I'm really just not sure about it. Let's go to our final book for this week. This is Star Wars number 15, written by Jason Aaron, with glorious artwork by the always stunning Mike Mayhew. This issue chronicles a story from part of Obi-Wan Kenobi's journal, which Luke uncovered in the first story arc. Dan and I have both recently talked about not really wanting to see an Obi-Wan adventure in the movies set between episodes 3 and 4, because it seems doubtful he could go on another galactic adventure without being found out by Vader, and that would just be an excuse to do another story with him. That just doesn't seem like something that actually would have happened. Yet I like this a lot. Rather than trying to force some grand space adventure for Ben Kenobi, Jason Aaron is doing what he's done all along with this book, logically filling in gaps and working with the history as we understand it rather than against it for the sake of cheap action or drama. I've been impressed by how exciting and epic these stories have been and how worth telling I found them, even though they're set in between the important action set pieces and we already know what's going to ultimately happen to these characters. He's not just drawing a line from a point A and a point B we have already, but telling real stories in between other real stories, and as I've said before, they've often been so good it's hard not to feel like I'm watching a Star Wars movie that was never produced, and they even sometimes feel as grand as the story they're supplementing, especially Vader Down. At first, this issue feels like it's just a snapshot in a period of time we haven't really spent with Obi-Wan or Luke, his teenage years, with Obi-Wan secretly looking after him and making sure no harm comes to him. But by the end, it reads like there may be a real character arc unfolding for Obi-Wan. He's conflicted because, like Luke's Uncle Owen, he sees so much of Anakin in Luke. He craves adventure, he's a natural-born pilot, he's already showing signs that the Force is strong in him, but Obi-Wan also knows Luke may be the galaxy's best hope for peace, and even suggests, sadly and against hope, that the prophecy about the Jedi who would bring balance to the Force may have been referring to Anakin in an indirect way, that it actually happens through Anakin's downfall and his son learning from those mistakes. That sounds like grasping, of course, and that's because it is. Obi-Wan is trying to retain his optimistic attitude, and he's struggling hard to do so. He spends his time protecting Luke in the shadows, making sure he and his family aren't attacked by sand people, and when he anonymously gives Luke the spare parts he needs to fix up a speeder he crashed and enter a race, sound familiar? That's the last straw for Owen, who goes to Ben's cave and confronts him. It's a really well-written showdown and fits perfectly into the continuity we see in A New Hope. Owen discourages Luke from adventure of any kind, worried he'll turn into his father, and Obi-Wan encourages it because he thinks it's paramount to the future of the galaxy that Luke embrace the Force. He wants to train Luke as a Jedi, but Owen won't have it, and he respects that because Owen is Luke's family. Owen straight up blames Ben for what happened to Anakin, evoking what becomes the main theme for Ben's character arc. Trouble always finds him. Aaron finds interesting ways to explore Ben's character in bridging the gap between the Clone Wars era and the original trilogy, and as a lot of the current expanded universe has been doing, does his best to make things make sense between the two eras that don't gel if you only watch the films. Obi-Wan is the swashbuckling Errol Flynn type hero who always gets out of impossible situations unscathed, but the reality is he watches less fortunate friends tragically die or turn to the dark side along the way, and Aaron puts him in a situation where he's forced to ask if his carefree, everything will work out, black and white attitude is to blame for that. I also really like that this story, which seems to be continuing on to the next issue, is being published concurrently with the Obi-Wan and Anakin series, so we can read Obi-Wan in his early days of training Anakin and finally see the approach he took and how responsible he might really be for Anakin's dark turn, and simultaneously his time in exile, as he has a hand in setting Luke on his own path, which of course has the potential to go the same way his father's did. I've loved this Marvel Star Wars status quo and how closely linked a lot of these books have been. It's fantastic that that's continuing in a character and thematic way across books, even set in different eras, and gives us more of a reason to want to buy each of them. The biggest selling point to this issue, and it's easily enjoyed without reading a single previous issue, is the artwork, masterfully drawn by Mike Mayhew, no relation, as far as I'm aware, to Peter Mayhew, who plays Chewbacca. Mike Mayhew gained critical acclaim for his stunning work on Dark Horse's The Star Wars, which adapted George Lucas's original first draft of the first film. The faces here are wonderfully expressive, and the close-ups are incredibly photorealistic. Like The Star Wars, it's cinematic, epic, and dripping with reverence for these iconic characters and settings. It's a treat to get a fill-in artist of this caliber, and to see the early days of the original trilogy-era Star Wars universe as we know it, imagined by the guy who so irreverently interpreted Lucas's original concept to the page. And this is certainly a pickup for me. As I said, very easy to just pick this up, and even if you haven't read any of the Star Wars stuff from before this, certainly this is a storyline that is continuing on, so you may be committed to buying a couple more issues, and I haven't looked into this to see just how long this story arc is going, but even if you pick this up and this is all you read, I think you'll really enjoy it for the artwork, and it might be worth having in your collection if you're a big Star Wars person, just for the art. Let's go on now to best issue this week and best cover. And of the 5 that I reviewed, I have a really hard time. It comes down between Star Wars and Silver Surfer for me, but I think I'm going to have to go with Silver Surfer. This, as I said, just hit me in all the right places and loved everything that it had to say and all the thought-provoking stuff about stories and protagonists and making those things real and how important that is to our culture and just living in general. And I don't usually do this, but I'm also going to choose this for best cover because, as I said, I really appreciate thematically what the cover has to do with the rest of the book and a lot of the fun choices for all the silly little trinkets and toys and things on the cover. Every time I look at it, I find something new, and I really enjoy that. And that's what this book is all about, and that's what the experience reading the book is like. So it's this cover is really indicative not just of what the book's about and what happens in the story, but also just what the book is, the book's general identity. Everybody, thanks as always for watching. Sure hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you again next week for some more new acquisitions. If you are ever in the Kansas City area, be sure to check out Elite Comics in Overland Park, Kansas. They are a great store, and we sure appreciate everything they do for us. I'm Captain Logan, and happy reading.